Okay, thank you. And we come to our final session. This is no means last and least. This is critical stuff, and in many ways the most difficult, but the most important challenge is how to think about all the kind of things that have been raised this morning. How do we start to think about policy responses? And I think that was the departure point in terms of the last question in the previous session and the responses that were given by the panelists. This is where things obviously become the most challenging, the most urgent, and the most essential. So our three speakers are Lloyd Broad at Birmingham City Council. We already heard from Lloyd earlier. Professor Simon Collinson, who's the head and the director of the City-REDI Institute at the University of Birmingham, which is leading on this big research project, and Professor Paul Forrest from the West Midlands Economic Forum. So I suggest we stick to the ordering that we've already been proposed. Again, we'll try to stick to 10 minutes for presentation, and then we'll move to questions from the floor.
Lucky me, I get 2 bites of the cherry, but I'm mindful that you've had a lot of talking at you today, so I think with the time we have left, I won't be 10 minutes, I'll be pretty brief and leave a couple of hooks that I think have been picked up at various points during today that I think lead to a proper discussion and debate in terms of the real policy challenges. So I've got 5. And I'll literally name them with a small comment on them. One, policy challenges is post-Brexit funding policy. Cities like Birmingham have accessed, in the last 25 years, over £1 billion worth of funding that's had huge investments in this city from both business support, physical infrastructure support, employment and skills support. Once that is lost, what replaces it? How is it replaced? And how are we enabled to use it to best effect? Funding policy is critical. The second is inclusive growth. I talked earlier this morning about those that have been left behind. I talked about cohesion and democracy, rebuilding bridges with people. There's not been an awful lot of talk today about people, but as a local authority, it's critical to us. And I think it's, if we want a policy debate, ask the question why this country has had no neighbourhood policy in the last 10 years. And we have so many deprived neighbourhoods, worklessness, poverty. There's a question there to be asked around poverty policies that can tackle inclusive growth. The third, which I think everyone's touched upon today, is skills, talent and productivity. But again, it's about people. What can we do about employment and skills and making sure that the impact and all of those things discussed today, again, those impacts on people and the need that we have for higher level skills leading to better productivity. The fourth is about maintaining global competitiveness as a city. I won't repeat all the things that Nikki said about investment, but city attractiveness, making Birmingham a place where people want to invest, work, live, play. Critically important to the future post-Brexit. So that's another challenge. And last but not least, it's about ongoing access to knowledge, cooperation and driving innovation. It's linked to all the things above about funding for it, about the skills and talent linked to it. But I think, and what I said earlier about the ability for cities to share knowledge, best practice, cooperate on all key challenges that affect everybody across Europe, including those in our cities, is critical. So policy, inclusive growth, skills, global competitiveness and investment, and knowledge. Happy to have a discussion about any of those things through a more open discussion.
Short and sweet. So I think we'll all be short and sweet and just try and save some time for interaction in the audience. Thanks very much. So I think Brexit for me is another reminder that we don't particularly live in a wholly rational world. Individual decisions, group decisions are made on the basis of much more than economic rationality. And as academics, we tend to gravitate towards economic rationality as one explanation for behaviour. And people don't follow those rules. And I think this sort of decision, but also the process that we're seeing government go through since then is based on, a huge amount of superficial logic, some political chaos and infighting that is, taking us around in circles. However, I'm going to get a bit more positive about where we're at a little later on in what I'm going to say. And I think the first really positive thing to say about today is that we are starting to see some research emerge that brings evidence to bear on the debate. The debate so far has been pretty free of good evidence. And some may say this evidence has come too late because we've taken the vote. I don't believe that. Brexit is not a binary occurrence. Brexit is a process, and the form of agreements that we get across a whole range of areas in the next year is going to be critical to how we fare as a nation. So it's not too late. There are 3 reasons we need this evidence. First of all, to inform the public, and that's a really difficult thing when the public is actually quite cynical at the moment for various reasons about experts and expertise. Secondly, to steer businesses and business managers, but I have to say that large firms and the consulting firms, including KPMG, who we've heard from today, are pretty much on top of some of this because they have a range of mechanisms and ample resources to invest in what the hell they're going to do. How do they respond as organizations to this? But I think thirdly, where this evidence can really play to enhance our ability to adapt is in policy. And policymakers don't have the resources, they don't have the time to get into sophisticated, complex understanding of what's going on. I think they need this kind of research to lay out the options and the trade-offs that are important around the Brexit occurrence. So I'm going to focus on policy because this is a session on policy. And Lloyd has laid out some of the challenges, and I'm going to come on and I'll finish in a minute with 4 key challenges that I see. But for the regional authorities, and particularly the Mayor's Office, the Combined West Midlands Authority, for the LEPs, for the Chamber of Commerce and others, there are existing challenges that we are working on and have been working on pre-Brexit, and Brexit adds a layer of complexity to those existing challenges. One is the need to maintain growth in a region that has underperformed historically and is locked in with a set of constraints, skills, infrastructure, our regional positioning and so on, that we've been working to step out and step around from for quite a long time. And around that need to maintain growth, the need to develop a coherent industrial strategy that is right for the region. What is not just our current competitive advantage, and Frank's insightful research, I think, adds real value to an understanding of our relative competitive advantage, but what are our future potential competitive advantages given the changes we've heard about today? And what are the distinctive regional constraints on growth that we have to, again, overcome if we're going to move quicker than other regions? So the first thing is the growth agenda itself. We've been working on this pre-Brexit, and it still is top of the agenda. Secondly, inclusive growth. This is not just a PR exercise regionally or nationally. I genuinely believe that at some point, better economic performance becomes completely irrelevant if unequal distribution leads to social and political challenges that overwhelm a region or a country. There is no point in talking about performance and productivity and profit if effectively social disharmony and the political backlash that creates really undermines everything you do as a country. So we have to focus genuinely on the improvement in alleviating the unequal distribution of wealth and the inequality in the access to opportunity and jobs, again, regionally and nationally. And thirdly, it's been mentioned, but I think this is a key one, and it's part of the 4 I'm going to come up with in a second around policy change. We have to win greater level of devolved resources and power to actually configure an industrial strategy and an inclusive growth strategy that is right for the region. Let's go back to the research then, to key up the 4 challenges and ideas I have for policy. Phil McGann and Raquel's research is truly insightful because it gives us an idea based on the added value in our exports and our embeddedness as a region, as a country, in a number of hugely complex global value chains. And it shows that we have, as a region, a massive regional exposure to any increase in the constraints to trade with Europe. So in his words, in Phil's words, data shows how much different regions need to adapt, to adjust to the impact of different Brexit scenarios. And this region has one of the biggest challenges amongst many. Now, the key word for me here is adaptability. People talk about resilience. I tend to look at adaptability and agility, and there is a massive need for us to understand how adaptable we can be regionally, and what are the challenges and the constraints on shifting, transforming, transitioning the regional economy to take account of these new threats and opportunities. So I've got 4 particular issues, because I think managers are coping with this, and organizations that are private sector driven have either resilience or they die. They either continue to make profits or they fall out of the market. Public sector organizations and regions as a whole don't. So we need to understand how we can help policymakers adapt to this. So the first thing I'd say is that the trend data and the scenarios we've seen today are based on the past. Actually, this region is on a roll. This region is doing phenomenally well. There are new trends and new changes that in fact are bucking some of our history, including, most importantly, a real increase in inward foreign direct investment and investment from the rest of the UK into the Birmingham region. We've got growth in jobs, we've got some increase in productivity, we've got a high business birth rate, but we've also got a high business death rate, which we've got to cope with. But actually, some of those trends suggest that the past is not as good an indicator of the future of the region as we might see from some of the data we've seen. So that's the first thing. We need to not just build on the past, we need to think about the future to negate some of the negative impacts of Brexit that we've seen today. So the second point I'd make to policy is then you've got to see what you can be good at, not just what you used to be good at, or what actually are the constraints that are holding you into a particular way of doing things in the past. So we've got to focus much more coherently on high value, high productivity jobs. And to do that, we've got to spot which are the good firms in the region that innovate effectively and draw from the regional endowments and draw their innovative capability from what the region offers them. Because those firms will do 2 things for us. They'll continue to innovate, therefore they'll adapt round the costs that might be increased from Brexit. They'll adapt round the skills constraints that we know the region is faced with, and they'll adapt around other constraints that we know are regional, because they're innovative and they're fast-moving firms. We need to refocus public policy efforts to understand who those firms are, and actually create better conditions for firms to innovate within the region. The minute you do that, you retain the best firms, you help them innovate, but you also attract innovative firms from other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So enhancing our regional capacity to innovate by supporting firms that innovate well, I think is a key signal to what policymakers should be doing. The third lesson from this, and it really stems exactly from that firm focus, is that we need to better understand how firms are going to react to Brexit. We've talked a lot today about firms. Actually, I've sat in a lot of rooms with policymakers, including the Mayor's office, including the LEPs and others, and there is a real gap in understanding about what firm strategies are evolving in response to Brexit. Now, as David knows, and we've also heard from Justin Benson from KPMG on automotive, if JLR decides to move significant investments out of the region or into the region as a response to the tipping points that Brexit brings, it will blow away a whole range of minor interventions that the government is talking about, from training to startups, to spin-outs, to setting up roundabouts to improve transport connectivity, and so on and so forth. The behavior of firms is absolutely critical. Policymakers are not understanding enough about how firms are going to react, and they are not integrating an understanding of private sector strategies into their regional policy and their industrial strategies. So we need to understand what they're going to do, and we need to maintain some level of insights as we configure policies which are devoting quite small amounts of resources to nudging the regional economy. So finally, my last point here is that, again, we've not discussed this. It came up a little bit at the end under a few comments that we've seen. Regional governance structures vary immensely across the whole of the country. We happen to be in a situation where we've got quite a good one. I'd suggest, possibly temporarily, but certainly historically, we're in a situation where we've got a high level of coherence relative to other regions between the actions of LEPs, between what businesses are wanting to do and trying to do, between the Chamber of Commerce and within a combined authority that has a Conservative mayor, that has great links with Westminster. And we are being listened to as a pilot region for industrial strategies by Bays and Treasury. That coherence is incredibly fragile, yet it is absolutely essential to do all of the things I've talked about. If you want to configure a regional industrial strategy, if you want to get joined up behaviour, and you want to work supporting the firms, solving skills, taking some control over education, improving infrastructure, you've got to get more devolved power and more devolved resources, but you've got to have political coherence to do that. And we're in a situation where we have it. If it disappears and we go back to infighting, political lobbying within the region, Treasury, Bays, Westminster will be the first to turn around and say, you are not competent to take on resources and take on responsibility for growing your region, and that makes me a bit worried. And that might sound a bit negative. The point I'm making is the place is on a roll. The region's doing really well. I think we have the raw materials to sidestep, cope with, adapt to many of the challenges that come with Brexit, but we need to maintain the current momentum to do that. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if the City Council knows something that we don't know, but the Union Jack flag's upside down at the minute, which is a sign of distress, so maybe they've got better knowledge than us. The main thing is, just a few comments, is I don't think we can reverse Brexit. Even if we wanted to reverse it, I don't think the European Union or the Commission would be too enamoured with it. And I think once you've triggered Article 50 and we're no longer in part of the European budget process for the next budget cycle, we'd have to trigger Article 49 of the Treaty of Lisbon, which would mean we would have to join the euro if it still exists in a few years' time, and we wouldn't get the rebate that we currently enjoy. So I don't think it's possible to go back to where we were before the referendum. I think one of the things to point out with the West Midlands, it wasn't just the left behind that voted to remain, but virtually the whole region by substantial majorities, with the exception perhaps of Birmingham, where it was a more narrow majority, apart from Warwick, voted to leave. And I think one of the things is that there's the assumption is that we're benefited from membership of the European Union. In political terms, certainly we haven't had to put khaki on in the last 40 or 50 years, which is a positive thing. But actually in terms of economic performance, if you measure GDP per capita in Britain as a proportion of US GDP per capita over the last 60 years, it's remained at about 75 to 70%, which suggests quite terrifyingly that the British political establishment failed to take advantage to transform the economy by its membership of the European Union, and therefore the same government structure is expected to lead to the sunny uplands of Brexit, and therefore we need a fundamental reassessment of how we structure our governments to respond to the world. The other thing is to point out is the West Midlands wasn't out of step with Europe. Quite a lot of the European population isn't enamoured with the European Commission and the way things are going. If you look at the French presidential elections in the first round, 48% of the vote went to candidates that wanted to leave or were critical of the European Union. In Italy, we're about to get a very strange government that is also critical about the euro and perhaps wants to leave. And there are some very strange things happening with regard to the rule of law in Central Europe and parts of Eastern Germany. So I think that there is a fundamental disconnect with the wider population in the European Commission, and there are some fairly big problems there. In terms of one of the big problems we have as economists is for the last couple of years, economists have been telling people how stupid they were in voting this way rather than coming up with a policy response on how we actually deal with a fairly major political problem. And I think the project will actually look at this project to actually develop a database on actually trying to understand what the regions are doing is actually really fundamental. And that's one of the big problems we have about looking at the English regions in particular, is we don't have a really accurate database that actually tells you what's really going on within our regions. I think another problem is that if we remained within the European Union or we leave the European Union, the problems confronting the West Midlands would have been the same, and that's problems in terms of connectivity and infrastructure, including skills. And we need to look at why there's not just an asymmetric regional devolution, there's a massive asymmetry in the way fiscal allocation takes place in this country. If you look at London with a population of 8.2 million, compared to the Midlands, east and west of 10.3 million, the difference in transport capital infrastructure spending, I think, is approximately about £13 billion over the last 5 or 6 years. And I would like to find the economist that can tell me that spending £32 billion on Crossrail 2 is going to produce a greater GVU uplift than spending £50 million on electrifying the Midland Main Line. There's some big problems in the a priori assumptions that we make when we look at the regions. So I do think we need to look at, perhaps maybe the West Midlands isn't in a huge fiscal deficit with the National Exchequer, particularly when HMRC itself says it's very difficult to calculate the regional flows. And if you use the Manchester model for calculating regional fiscal flows, it looks like we're in a much stronger position, and we should be arguing for a much greater devolution of fiscal expenditure. And in terms of infrastructure, we also need to look at quite a lot of things such as internet sovereignty. A lot has been made about moving to manufacturing 4.0, but we don't have internet sovereignty. If we're going to have driverless cars, you're going to have to use the American GPS system. What happens if you get a fairly right-wing, trade protectionist American president in place that stops you having free access to GPS? We're already having problems that we're getting kicked out of the Galileo project, which is one of the key things that the European Union was doing to look at greater internet sovereignty. So we do need to, I think what Brexit will do is it's one of many problems. I mean, there is a problem with electric cars. The government seems to be advocating this is a pollution-free solution, but according to the Swedish Environmental Agency, the impact of constructing and using an electric car for 7 years is the same as using a petrol car for 7 years, and the emissions are probably worse with an electric car. Plus, we haven't built any power stations recently, so if there's a fluctuation in the national grid when it's half-time in an FA Cup final, God knows what it's going to do when we have to build all this infrastructure to power everybody's electric cars. So I think the problems as being highlighted today are huge, but as was also said, they're not insurmountable provided we have the right policy responses.
Well, thank you very much. Some very rich observations and comments there from the panel. So I think we've got time to take some questions. And if we pass the microphone down to the floor. So in the far corner at the back. Over the far corner at the back.
Hi, my name's Andrea Collins. I work for a company called the Export Department. So we provide support, advice and outsourced exporting services for novice exporters and also experienced exporters. I'm interested in your discussion about how businesses are going to adapt to Brexit, which sadly I think is probably going to happen. Our challenge that we're finding, and indeed my peers within the Institute of Export are finding, is a step before that. So we're not even getting to the point of helping our clients to learn how to adapt for the changes. We're actually struggling to get them to consider the impact that Brexit is going to have on their business. So getting them to consider, what the VAT implications are, what the implications are for their EU workers. I'm sure much of it is driven by the uncertainty around what Brexit is actually going to look like. However, we're finding that at least amongst the SME community, there's a staggeringly high level of complacency or inertia. It's kind of the attitude is kind of, well, we'll look at it when it happens, which in our opinion, and certainly amongst my peers within the Institute, is that's actually too late. And I'd be interested to know from the panel and indeed people attending today, whether they're finding that same level of complacency, and if they have any strategies or any experience of actually getting companies to start considering the potential impact now, rather than waiting to the end of the transition period. Thank you.
Who would like to take that one first? Simon?
So I've done a little work on SMEs. There are other experts here. But I think most of what we know bears out your impressions. I mean, small firms, regardless of Brexit, have a very small amount of resources. They have very little time to actually invest in understanding strategically what the future might bring or adapt strategically to that. They are very much hand to mouth, and the smaller the firm, the more hand to mouth it is. They really have only time to deal with the real practicalities of what's hitting them right, in the next week or month. So that's not very helpful, but the reason there's so much churn, i.e. business failure and business birth rate in the UK, is because of that need to adapt. Basically, firms are not strategically informed, therefore they simply go out of the market, and they re-enter and they go out of the market because they fail. So that sounds a bit hopeless. I think large firms, as I indicated earlier, are in a different position. They've got the resources and they're investing in understanding how they need to reconfigure the locations of their activities to account for what Brexit might bring. But coming back to small firms, I think they're the key problem, and I think the CBI, the Small Business Federation, and a number of other bodies are trying to put information sheets and support through counselling and through meetings, some idea of the different scenarios and some idea of the practical challenges, from paperwork to tax to import-export cost additions that will come from Brexit. The dilemma I hear from them is there's a chicken and egg problem. We actually don't, there are a range of scenarios, they've been presented today, we don't actually know which of those scenarios will be the final outcome. Therefore, you're sort of giving a menu of possibility to small firms, and they find that, again, difficult to take action on the behalf of those companies, because they've got small amounts of money to invest in what might be coming. I think, again, regardless of all that, any efforts that we can make to push firms to think more seriously about exports, to reduce their dependency on domestic market and regional supply chains, is going to help. Anything we can do to subsidise or to support or inform them of the opportunities in and beyond Europe in export and import terms, so that they really stretch themselves and become more international, is going to be a positive step forward. But this is a very difficult time for small firms.
I'll just say one quick thing. You talk about adaptation and different scenarios, and I can imagine it must be, I work in the public sector, what would I know about business? But I can imagine trying to find the headspace to try and absolutely understand, what do I need to do, what do I need to prepare for, where it's so unknown, can almost be impossible. What am I adapting to? What I do know is I think over the 2 years since the vote to leave the European Union, a lot of organisations have been doing a lot more to try and unpick and understand what those scenarios are and make them more visible to businesses, so they don't have to do the real thinking themselves. It can almost be done for them. And just one point of reference that I'm aware of is our colleagues up the road at the Chamber of Commerce have produced a Brexit toolkit for SMEs, which I think maps out some of those scenarios and starts to help them along their way towards that adaptation. And I think we need more of that. We need to support them along the way in terms of giving them what those scenarios really mean in their particular circumstance.
I think part of the problem is a lot of SMEs don't realise they export. They'll just say that they sell their stuff to Jaguar Land Rover, or they'll sell it to Rolls Royce, and obviously with 80% of their product going overseas, quite a lot of SMEs don't realise they actually are involved in the export market. And it may be that as the French probably in particular start to insist on more draconian rules of origin rules, that those things may come in a bit harder. The other problem is, and this is again where we're going to have to look at how you transform the governments in this country, is the paltry coverage of the membership business organisations of the actual business sector. And one of the things we're probably going to have to adopt is something that was in the Heseltine report, which said that to be a registered company, you have to be a member of a Chamber of Commerce or something like that, so that the way we transmit information has a much greater coverage than the partial one we have at the minute. On the positive side, Britain is actually very different from most other EU countries in that apart from Malta, it's the only economy that exports more to non-EU countries than to EU countries, whereas all the rest of them are exporting to each other.
More questions? We have a gentleman on the left here, lady with the yellow jacket, and the man at the back with the black jacket. I think we'll hold it with those three questions, okay?
Oh, hello, Mike Welch, Coventry University Economics Course Director. I just had a question, something that Frank was saying about one solution maybe to cut costs would be greater agglomeration. I just wondered what may be the impact of that on regional inequalities, and would devolution be part of a solution to any negative impact?
Frank. I mean, I don't know. Frank will correct me, but my take on this is there is the possibility for bigger scale economies in agglomeration. So there'll be clustering, and there'll be clustering towards areas that have particular specializations and particular advantages. The counter view to that is the technological revolution, which suggests that actually some aspects of distance, I mean, physical product movements and some face-to-face business is going to be done easier across larger distances. And I see two competing trends there, and I haven't figured out quite, because I think it's very sector-specific and almost firm and business activity-specific, how those two will play out against each other. So that's not a good answer. And if it was Frank's data that you were looking at that led you to think that, you probably have to ask Frank for the definitive answer between those two.
I'll give you a very obvious perspective from a local authority. Agglomeration is important, and I think when we're investing around the world or competing around the world or trying to sell what we are and what we can offer, that's when it becomes really pertinent. And I think what we have is, I don't necessarily agree with what you said earlier, which is part of a response to this question, which is about we have coherent governance. Relatively. Compared to other, let's call them European member states, for example, I think we have overly complex governance, which is really problematic. On a daily basis, I'm not quite sure whether I'm wearing a local government hat, a Birmingham City Council hat, a LEP hat, a Combined Authority hat, or a Midlands Engine hat. And I'm different things in different places all the time. So from a person that lives and breathes this world on a day-to-day basis, it's a very overly complex and confusing landscape for us that work in it, never mind those that don't. So agglomeration is good if we're selling our wares to China and we go over as a Midlands Engine and selling the whole of the belt across the middle of the country and say, come and invest in the Midlands, because at the end of the day, they will understand that scale and that scope and that agglomeration. When it comes to devolution, I will talk about subsidiarity, and I will talk about getting subsidiarity down to the lowest level. I look at index of multiple deprivation, yet look at the millions of pounds we've invested in skills and employment initiatives that haven't made a scrap of difference. Why? Because it's overly centralised national policies of employment and skills that don't scratch the surface of what we need to do in cities. So I will talk about subsidiarity rather than agglomeration. So I think it's horses for courses. Depending on what you want to talk about, it's relevant. In other areas, I think less so.
Well, I think that's where the infrastructure question is really important. If you look at how we have innovation in the West Midlands, it's because 4 or 5 curmudgeonly black country manufacturers will come together and produce something. And when you produce an axle or a ball bearing, it's probably 4 or 5 little companies have to work together to do it. And therefore, if you're going to be successful with agglomeration, you're really going to have to look at your internal connectivity and transport infrastructure and across the whole range. It's ridiculous that your largest concentration of SME manufacturing units in the Black Country, if you have to drive from Dudley to Wolverhampton, it can take over an hour. And that's obviously having a big drain on productivity. So I think, again, it comes back to that question that being able to identify where the local needs are. And perhaps the best example is where 3 railway stations, probably 4 that we're going to have, aren't going to be connected. Whereas when they built the Bull Ring, somebody could have come up with a bright idea of putting a tunnel underneath and connecting that with Moore Street. And similarly, we should have built an extra couple of railway lines under Birmingham New Street to actually connect Shrewsbury and the rest of the region in. It's having that joined up thinking at a local level that would really boost the economy.
And I think we have 2 more questions. The lady in the yellow jacket, and then afterwards the man behind in the black jacket. So, yep.
Hello, I'm Janet King and I'm a campaigner for the European movement, and we are campaigning for a democratic people's vote and for a third option in the October parliamentary vote, and that option being not to accept either form of Brexit, either with a deal or without a deal, or nor being forced to abstain, but actually being allowed a vote to remain. So we're not giving up. But my question is not political, it's not about that. It's about the largest, we're the largest recipients of research and development funding from the EU, and I believe that funding, there are still applications going on, I know, for ASF funding and for ERG funding as well. So they haven't given up on us. How are we going to replace that? And this was a question really for the engineers as well as the other policymakers. How are you going to replace funding that's included funding for Warwick University, for instance, for lower vehicle emissions research, for my local university, Worcester? This is not relevant perhaps so much here, but for mental health research. And for Birmingham University and Aston Wolverhampton, millions and millions of pounds for communications. How are you going to replace it? Could we have some concrete suggestions? I don't think our government will either be minded, the present government will either be minded to replace that or will have the ability, actually, without increasing taxation. What are you going to do about it?
What are we going to do about it? Some of us are doing something about it. What control and leverage we'll have over providing a definitive answer to your question is questionable, but we're having a go. I made reference this morning in terms of my contribution to some of the things we've been doing locally and nationally and across Europe. And when you think about funding and replacing funding, I'll look at it in two particular aspects. There is the domestic aspect of the funding. You used the acronyms ESF and ERDF, which is the People and Skills Fund and the Physical Infrastructure and Business Funds. That is stuff, when I made reference to us receiving over £1 billion worth of this sort of stuff, that's the bread and butter EU money that we get back. It's worth over £6 billion over that 7-year period in England. So it's quite significant. And their proposal is to introduce something called a Shared Prosperity Fund. They've started consulting with a range of stakeholders around the country, including local governments, the core cities, the university sector and many other sectors, about the nature of that shared prosperity fund. It's still about trying to address regional imbalances, and that's intra-regional imbalances within the UK as well. And part of that consultation process right now is what would the key features of a UK shared prosperity fund look like? What sort of features of the current EU programmes would we want to keep? And what sorts of things and features would we want to ditch? And then what would be the governance arrangements that you'd wrap around that be like to enable cities to have the full devolved powers and ability to spend those in a localised manner against localised industrial strategies rather than national strategies that dictate how we spend the money. So we're in consultation with them with regards to what that SPF, Shared Prosperity Fund, would look like. And we have some very similar principles. We want it to be over long-term plans, 7 to 10-year programmes. We want at least minimum values. We want it fully devolved, greater flexibility, local prioritisation and targeting, key principles like that. The second aspect is the more collaborative funds. So you talk about funds for universities, for research, for innovation, etc. So we talk about Horizon 2020 funding, for example. I think the government are minded to want to maintain access to these, and you can maintain access to these programmes even if you're not an EU member. Norway accesses Horizon 2020 programmes. So there's a discussion to be had and there's a negotiation to be had about how we maintain access to what I call collaboration programmes. Cities like mine, where you get engaged in less so Horizon 2020, but other collaboration programmes like Interreg, URBACT and others, which is cities sharing knowledge with cities on key issues like climate change adaptation or migration or issues of that ilk. And I did mention earlier about some of our asks to the European Union and things we want to raise is about our ability, where possible, to, when we leave the European Union, pay in by our presence in these initiatives to maintain that ability to share knowledge, innovation, competitiveness, skills, etc., talent, and maintain that ability to cooperate around Europe. So discussions are going on, yeah, on the latter that I've just talked about. I'm hopeful that we'll still be able to access those. For the earlier ones, which are the domestic focused ones, there will be a new programme that we're seeking to influence.
Simon, would you like to?
Well, just very briefly, I think there are two different types of funds, and we need to differentiate between them. One is the regional, which I think there are probably more questions around than the research for universities. I think that's, I'm not saying it's going to compensate for what we might lose, but UKRI now is in formation and it's pulling together the research councils and Innovate UK, and that's a 7 billion budget. We've increased the amount of funding going through those channels, and it is going into things from anything from mental health to STEM asset investments. And the ambition of the government, whether we ever get there or not, is to achieve, up to 3.2% of R&D of national GDP spent on R&D. At the moment, we're in the low 2.2 to 2.3%. So there's an ambition to increase the proportion of the national budget that goes into R&D, and specifically have universities and firms working more closely together, sometimes at the regional level, to use those funds. Whether it ever compensates for what we lose from moving out of the EU is a very open question. And the regional development funds, which have really assisted places like the West Midlands, there's even bigger question marks over what they will be replaced over in terms of the magnitude of the money we used to get from those sources.
I think one of the big problems is that the Treasury failed to maximise the potential revenue or funding we could have got from the European Union. In contrast to all other European countries, they adopted some Byzantine scheme, but which meant we never had matched funding really taking place, and that really compromised in a number of areas. So instead of saying it's not just a matter of looking at the funds that we did get, but looking at how we come up with a much more comprehensive and transparent system of funding research and development.
And we have one last question, okay?
Thank you. Mike Leonard from the Building Alliance. I think in this perfect world that we describe post the or pre the Brexit vote, we forget to understand that we have a £56 billion trading deficit in January this year, despite the currency being in the best possible place. So I wonder how we're going to build the circular economy. If I listen throughout today, I could be forgiven for believing that the West Midlands economy is just about automotive. Yeah, that's it. That's us. We're a one-trick pony. Of course, we're not. And there's huge industries out there and supporting, for instance, construction, which is probably the biggest single thing that we're going to do in this region over the next 15 years. Is build the things we need, including the new infrastructure and a lot of homes. It concerns me that in our industry, which gets little or no recognition support in the building products sector, in fact, we've got the opposite going on. So we've got government actually actively proposing modular construction, timber frame construction and steel coming in from abroad to replace the manufacturing businesses that we've got actually in this region, because it's where we make it all. And 80% of what we make, 80% of materials that go to build a house, for instance, are made here in the UK. So my question to the panel is, how do we take this opportunity? We have to treat it as an opportunity, not a threat. So my friend who says, well, why is business accepting it? Well, business has to treat everything as an opportunity. How do we take the opportunity to build the circular economy and create as many jobs as we possibly can, particularly through the inclusive position that you're talking about, really, where we've still got, in this region and also in this area, 12,000 people who are in the youth of this city who are unemployed, and we can't move into employment. We can do that in construction. How do we take that opportunity? Thank you.
Who would like to take that one? Simon?
Quick go and then I'll... Yeah, so no, I think your point is very well taken. And first of all, we have a fairly robust analysis of what exactly the regional economy is made up of. And you're right, we've heard a lot about automotive today, but there are huge other business activities that are critically important. One of the things we're working on, which is critically important for these sorts of policy questions, is what is the different impact of different sectors and different firms on the region? And what's interesting about construction, not to contradict what you've just said, it is critically important, but if you take a very large construction firm, an awful lot of its impact is dissipated across the very large number of projects it does, either across the country or internationally. So when a construction company works on a project, its employment multiplier, the people it employs, and quite a lot of its supply chain tends to follow where those projects are based. If you take an automotive company like JLR, its supply chain, and most of what it does, its back office, and its employees actually spend their money within the region. So if you compare a Carillion, God rest its soul, and a JLR, we know that the actual regional impact is magnitudes different because of the structure of what that firm does that actually impacts directly on the region. Now, that doesn't contradict what you've just said. It means we need much more intelligence about the differences in sectors, how they fit into different global trends and different firms that some people believe are really adding huge impact to the region and aren't, and other firms that probably are adding a lot more impact than we can actually tell through the data. Once we get that, policymakers then need to really treat firms differently because some of those firms are critical for the region, others less so.
I think answering your question is really difficult, but I'll provide two responses. One, I think some things potentially are in the gift of local government. As an example, I think we could and we should more effectively use planning and procurement policy to better effect with regards to how we do stuff, build stuff, make stuff in this city. And we do have something in Birmingham, for example, called the Business Charter for Social Responsibility that builds in a lot of, let's call it principles and conditions when it comes to us giving out large contracts as to what we expect in return for those contracts in terms of environmental impact, local inclusion, employment outcomes, etc. So I think that's important, and I think we can step up and do more and be even more adventurous than we are already. The second thing is it goes back to skills issues, and you talk about employment, etc. I think it goes back to the skills issues, and I think we need to do a lot more collectively around the ability around vocational education, training and employment, and particularly around apprenticeships. We within this local authority are looking at how we should be stepping up, perhaps as an exemplar employer in terms of utilising apprenticeships to better effect, to fill gaps and shortages we have as a local authority in key occupations in terms of delivering all sorts of, whether it's a housing caretaker or whether it's a construction worker, etc., etc. And again, working through our supply chain, construction supply chains, and working with employers, particularly in the growth sectors where there's stuff going on, where you see the cranes, notwithstanding working with Carillion, which of course was such difficult, but whether it's Birmingham Smithfield, HS2 Curzon, etc., etc., through our planning and procurement and through better partnership working with employers, potentially new employers and the FE sector and of course the HE sector, we should be doing a lot more to build up the skills of local people for them to take up the opportunities that are being developed.
Just quickly, I think the loss of capacity that were in the construction sector that were lost in the last recession, which has subsequently been replaced by international products, highlights one of the big failures of making use of EU funds. We could have adopted a Kurzarbeiter scheme where instead of just sacking people and making them redundant, you could have sent them on training courses. And there was something like 900 million euros available for the English regions that could have been used during the depth of the recession, but the Treasury refused to sign the document, which meant we could have protected that part of the construction sector. So it highlights the fact that going forward, we're going to be in a much more competitive and combative international and business environment, and therefore we need to look at how we have a proper industrial strategy that realises you can do things when everything's booming, but you've also got to do things when there's a downturn.
And just to clarify, actually, in terms of the data that the project has produced that you can access on the website, the construction industry is by far the least exposed major industry to Brexit of any industry. So the structure of the construction industry, the way it works, is very different to the majority of other industries. So the kind of issues that you're suggesting and the panel have kind of responded to are probably very pertinent. And in terms of other industries, which are very different, you might want to think about some of the differential responses at the policy level or institutional level. Anyway, I'd just like to thank the panel. It's been extremely interesting. I think everyone will accept that, will understand that. It's been terrific. And I'm going to ask Raquel now to come up here. For you to stay here, I'll step down. Okay.
Well, just a few words just to conclude today. First, very big thanks, I think, to you first to come here today and support us. Also to all the presenters. I think it has been a very interesting day or half a day. And and also all the people at City-REDI that has helped me to make this happen. So special thanks to Chloe, Denise, Sarah, who is at the registration, but also all the other colleagues. So the slides are going to be shared after the consent, of course, of all the presenters. We did the same for the Edinburgh ones, so are going to be shared among all the audience. And we are hoping to publish all of them at the website. So just follow us in the website. More blogs and reports are going to be coming very soon. And of course, if you have liked it today, so you are welcome also to join us next week in London and the week after in Leeds. As today we were talking about advanced manufacturing, next week we are talking about services. So all these questions about the private sector and the firms, we will have people from the CBI that they have put a report that they have discussed with ministers, and it's really going forward and making a big issue in terms of the negotiation. So if you are interested, we are going to have a presentation from people from the CBI next week. And just a logistic thing. Interviews are going to be taken here now during the lunch. So if you are going to be interviewed, please stay where you are. And for the other ones, we are asking you to please leave the room because the interviews, they need to be in silence. So enjoy the lunch and thank you very much for coming today. Thank you.